The photograph was the first thing I packed and the last thing I looked at before I left Earth. My grandfather standing in a white hall that smelled like recycled air and old ambition, his hand extended toward a Veth envoy named Chorus of Still Waters, 6 fingers curling over 5. Caption below read, "Humanity finds its place." He called it the best day of his life. I was 7 years old when he told me that. I believed him then because I did not yet understand what the word place meant when someone else chose it for you. I am Commander Sable Oren, 34 years old, born in the outer ring of Kepler 9b colony, and I have spent my entire career watching humanity be quietly, politely, thoroughly managed. This is the story of how that ended. This is also the story of how it cost us more than anyone who celebrated that photograph ever imagined paying. But we start where everything starts, with desperation. The year was 2091. Earth was not the shining sphere of science textbooks. It was a planet of 17 functioning governments, water rationing in 6 of the 9 megacities, and a population that had survived 2 near extinction events in the previous century through a combination of stubbornness, chaos, and dumb luck. We had colonies on Mars, on Callisto, on a dozen stations and settlements scattered across the outer system. We had ships, we had ambition. What we did not have was a cure. The pathogen came through a cargo transfer at Kepler 9b. Nobody knew how. It spread the way fire spreads through dry paper, not loudly, not dramatically, just thoroughly. 1 week it was a containment problem. 3 weeks later it was killing 10,000 people a day across 4 colonies. 6 weeks later, the number was bigger than I want to write here. We asked everyone. The Dravathi said they lacked the biological expertise. They said it politely, they said it fast. The Loran Collective said the pathogen was too specific to human biology. They were probably right. They did not sound sorry. The Accord Observer species sent formal letters of concern. Concern, written in 3 languages on expensive paper, is worth the same as silence when your people are dying in quarantine tents. The Veth responded in 48 hours. Their envoy arrived in orbit aboard a ship the size of a small city, gleaming and unhurried the way wealth arrives when it knows it is the only offer on the table. Chorus of Still Waters came down in a shuttle that landed so smoothly on the Geneva platform that the assembled human delegation actually clapped. I read that in the historical record later. They clapped for the landing. The cure was real. That was the first thing the Veth established clearly, and without drama. They had synthesized it. Already it was in the ship. All they needed was an agreement. My grandfather led the human delegation. His name was Commander Elias Oren. Retired, pulled back into service because he had a reputation for being both brilliant and willing to swallow bitter things without making faces. They needed him because the treaty was full of bitter things. Human ships, Article 3 stated, would require Veth Corridor Authority approval for any transit beyond the inner system boundary. The language said coordination. The meaning was permission. Human faster than light research, Article 7 stated, would proceed under Joint Accord supervision. The language said collaboration. The meaning was a leash. Earth would receive a permanent seat at the Galactic Accord table. Article 9 was the most elaborately Worded item in the document, 3 full pages describing the honor and significance of this position. It was an observer seat, non-voting. My grandfather signed it, he shook Chorus of Still Waters' hand with both of his, and the photograph caught the exact moment. 6 alien fingers wrapped over 5 human ones, his face full of something that looked like hope and something underneath the hope that I only recognized much later in life when I saw the same expression in the mirror. The cure went into distribution that night. The pathogen was neutralized in 11 weeks. The colony stabilized. Children who would have died lived. Instead, I was born on one of those colonies 4 years later. My mother survived because of that treaty. I exist because of that treaty. I have never once confused gratitude with respect. I grew up understanding what it meant to live on the approved side of a corridor. Our ships filed transit requests. Most were approved. Some sat in the queue for weeks without response, and we waited. Because waiting was what the treaty said we would do. Our engineers submitted research proposals that came back stamped redundant or under review and went into a drawer. Our scientists at Accord conferences sat in the seats along the back wall, the observer row, where the lighting was a little worse and the coffee was always slightly cold. Nobody hit us, nobody threatened us. Nobody was cruel in any way you could point to clearly. They just never forgot what the photograph meant, that we had needed them, that we had asked, that the hand reaching over us in the image was reaching down. I was 12 when I first understood that. Old enough to feel it. Young enough to still cry about it once in private, and then put the crying somewhere I did not visit again for a long time. My grandfather died when I was 22. He left me 3 things: a collection of old paper books, a debt from a medical treatment that I paid off over 6 years, and the framed photograph. I looked at it for a long time the night he died. I looked at his face in it. That expression I had finally learned to name. Relief. It was relief, the expression of a man who had just accepted a deal that would damage something important, because the alternative was watching everyone he loved disappear. I understood him completely. I put the framed face down on the shelf and went to sleep. The next morning I accepted my commission and began the career that would, over the following 12 years, take me from patrol routes in the inner ring to the Accord's Emergency War Council. That last part took a war to arrange. The Veth had kept their end of the agreement. The cure worked. The treaty was maintained. They treated humanity with the same careful, measured attention you give to something fragile you are responsible for, not unkindly, but from a height. And humanity, for 40 years, did what it does when it has no other options. It waited. It watched. It learned every hallway of the house it was not allowed to own. Chorus of Still Waters retired with honors in 2107. His successor inherited a quiet, well-managed relationship with the small human species. The Veth had no reason to worry. We filed our transit requests. We attended our observer sessions. We were, by every diplomatic measure, a model client species. What we were doing below that surface, none of them thought to ask. That was their only real mistake. Not the treaty, not the observer seat, not 40 years of corridors and permissions and cold coffee in the back row. The mistake was simpler than all of That they never looked at us and thought, what do they do when they are afraid? I could have told them. We prepare. The Accord kept excellent records. The Veth in particular were obsessive documentarians. Every interaction with every member and associate species was logged, reviewed, filed. They had archives stretching back 4,000 years of galactic history cataloged in systems that never lost a single entry. They filed 41 incident reports on humanity between 2091 and 2131. I have read all of them. I have read them many times, in fact, late at night, on long transit runs, in the hour before a briefing where I would sit in the observer chair and listen to people who had never lost a colony debate the future of the galaxy. They are taken together the most unintentionally funny documents in the history of diplomacy, not because the Veth were wrong about what they observed. They were not wrong. They were just wrong about what it meant. Report number 1, filed 2097. Human vessels observed conducting unsupervised navigational surveys in contested rim space. Vessels withdrew. Upon contact, no treaty violation. Confirmed, crew manifests list the surveys as geological research. Expeditions, methodology inconsistent with standard geological survey. Equipment loadouts. Pattern noted. My annotation, which exists only in my head and in this account, the equipment inconsistency they noted was because the ships were not surveying geology. They were mapping gravitational drift. Patterns in the corridor boundaries. The Veth Corridor Authority ran on fixed transit lanes. Fixed lanes have gaps. We were finding the gaps. We were not planning anything specific. At the time, Elias Oren had taught his daughter, who taught me. That information does not expire. You gather it because someday you will need it, and the day you need it is not the day to start gathering. He was right about most things. Report number 7, filed 2109. Human Engineering Collective has submitted 14 independent faster than light theoretical frameworks for Accord review under Article 7 supervision. Protocols, all 14 frameworks reviewed and returned as redundant iterations of existing Veth drive models. No treaty violation. Submission pattern unusual. Recommend continued monitoring. The frameworks were not redundant. They reached the same destination as Veth drive theory through completely different mathematics. Our path was shorter, not by much, 3 to 7% across different models, but across interstellar distances, 3% becomes a significant number of hours. We knew the review board would not see it. The review board was looking for violations, not innovations. They were reading our work the way you proofread a document, not the way you read a new argument. We sent 14 frameworks because we wanted them to say redundant 14 times. We wanted them to stop looking closely. We wanted them to be bored by us. They obliged. My name appears first in the incident reports in 2118. I was a junior navigation officer on the supply run between Callisto and the Dravathi Outer Station, a posting so unglamorous that the Accord Monitoring Division had a standing policy of reviewing its manifests only every third quarter. Report number. Crew psychological assessments from long duration human deep space missions continue to show anomalous results. Crews operating beyond documented psychological stress thresholds for extended periods without performance, degradation, 3 separate accord, research proposals to study human stress, response have not received response from, human delegation, recommend escalating request. They sent 4 more requests over the following 8 years, each one was received, acknowledged, filed, and quietly buried under workload. We did not want them studying us, not because we had anything to hide about our psychology, but because once you let someone else define how you work, you have handed them a tool. Knowledge of how a thing breaks is knowledge of how to break it. We had learned that lesson once already in a Whitehall in Geneva when we sat down at a table with nothing to offer and everything to lose. We did not sit at tables like that anymore. What the Accord reports could not capture because they were filed by observers looking at surfaces was everything happening underneath. The educational shift starting in the 2100s. Human children learning xenobiology, tactical linguistics, Accord procedural law not as curiosities as tools. Our universities produced more specialists in Accord systems and non-human psychology in the decade between 2105 and 2115 than in the entire previous century. Combined, the informal networks between human installations that the Accord had no framework for, not secret communications, nothing that violated any protocol, just people who knew each other, who talked, who shared information through channels that looked like friendship and were also something more organized than that. The quiet accumulation of what I can only call institutional memory. Every time a human diplomat was overruled in a committee session, the specific mechanism of the overrule was recorded, studied, and shared. Every time a human research proposal was returned as redundant, the exact language of the rejection was filed and cross-referenced against Accord review patterns. Every time one of our ships was held in a corridor queue, the delay was logged against transit data going back to 2091. We were building a complete picture of how the system worked, not to attack it, to understand it so thoroughly that when the moment came, we would not be surprised by any of it. The moment announced itself in 2131. The Churath had been a name in Accord security briefings for decades. A territorial species on the galactic eastern frontier, aggressive but historically limited in their ambitions. Manageable. The Accord had managed them for 60 years. Through a combination of diplomatic pressure and demonstrated military strength. Then something changed in their leadership. Nobody in the Accord fully understood what the Churath were. Not a species that explained themselves. What changed was visible in the results. They stopped responding to diplomatic pressure. They stopped being deterred by demonstrations. They began pressing the eastern frontier with a patience and a methodology that the Accord's military planners had not seen before. 3 member species went dark in 14 months, not conquered, dissolved, their supply networks cut, their communications degraded, their ability to organize a coherent response systematically dismantled before any single visible attack gave them something to defend against. The Accord called an emergency session in November of 2131. I was the human delegation representative 2 years into my posting, still technically in the Observer section, a seat along the left. Wall where the overhead light had a flicker that the maintenance staff had been promising to fix since my predecessor held the chair. Veth High Admiral Sareth of the Long Reach presented the tactical situation with the calm authority of someone who has never in his life been uncertain of his own competence. 7 ft tall, the particular gray-blue of deep ocean water in winter, with the 4-part vocal structure that made every Veth statement sound like it was being said in harmony with itself. He laid out the Eastern Frontier losses. He presented 3 strategic response options. He walked the assembled species through projected resource commitments, estimated timelines, expected outcomes. Then at the end, with the tone of someone remembering to mention a detail they consider minor, he turned toward the left wall. Human observer capacity will remain unchanged during this operation. Medical and supply support will continue through existing protocols. We appreciate the contribution. He moved on before anyone could respond. There was nothing to respond to. It was not a question. I looked at the flicker in the light above my chair. I looked at my notes. I looked at the data I had been compiling for the past 8 months. Since the first pattern of Churath movement had started to look familiar to me in a way that I had been trying to name and had finally named 2 weeks before this session. Familiar because it looked like us, not us now, us 100 years ago. Asymmetric, patient, designed not to win battles but to make winning battles irrelevant by the time you got around to fighting them. I had 17 months of behavioral modeling. The chip the size of my thumbnail. I had a counter doctrine built on 40 years of humanity watching, learning, and being quietly underestimated by everyone in this room. I had 42 predicted Churath target selections. We had already confirmed 19 of them. I sat in the observer chair under the flickering light. I thought about my grandfather's face in that photograph. I waited, not because I was unsure, because the moment had a shape and I wanted to feel the hold of it before I moved. Then I reached into my jacket pocket. The chip made a small flat sound when I set it on the table. Sareth of the Long Reach stopped mid-sentence. The room, all of it, went quiet. I apologize for the interruption, I said, and I did not apologize at all. I have something the council needs to see. 40 years of patience. 1 chip. The room had not finished being quiet before I started talking. The chip sat on the table between me and Sareth of the Long Reach like a question. Nobody in the room was ready to answer. He looked at it, he looked at me, he looked at it again with a particular expression of someone whose mental model of a situation has just received information it was not built to hold. This contains a full behavioral analysis of Churath operational doctrine, I said. 17 months of movement pattern modeling. Psychological profiling based on 600 years of their recorded conflict history and 42 predicted target selections ranked by probability. We have confirmed 19 of them already. The Loran representative, a slender species who communicated largely through color shifts in their secondary membranes, turned a shade I had spent years learning to read. It was the color they went when they were recalculating something they thought they had already finished calculating. The Dravathi liaison said nothing. The Dravathi liaison had not said anything unpredictable in 30 years of Accord sessions. He stared at the chip. Sareth's voice came in its four-part harmony, but the harmony was slightly off-register, not much enough. You have been conducting independent intelligence operations. We have been observing, I said. We were given observer status. We observed. Nobody in the room laughed. Nobody was going to laugh, but the logic of it sat there in the air, and it had a shape that everyone could feel, even if nobody was going to acknowledge it out loud. The remaining 23 targets, Sareth said carefully, are in the chip, I said, along with a complete counter doctrine, timing models for each predicted engagement, recommended interdiction points, a communication disruption framework designed specifically for how the Chirath build consensus in their command structure. You built all of this from observation alone. We built it from understanding, I said. There is a difference. He was quiet for a moment. 7 FT of composed authority, and the composure was doing real work right now, holding something in place that wanted to move. What do you want for it? He said. It was not really a question. Full fleet access, independent command, authority for human forces, permanent removal of corridor authority, supervision from all human, faster-than-light operations. I said it the way you read a list, not fast, not slow, with no extra weight on any particular item, because none of them needed extra weight. They were all the same weight. They were all the same ask. They were, stop managing us. Sareth looked at me for a long time. Those terms require full council ratification, he said. Then ratify them, I said. Chirath are 3 weeks from their 20th target. I know which installation it is. I know what time of day they will hit it, and from which approach vector. You have time to prepare a defense if we start now. He picked up the chip. He held it in his palm, those long, six-fingered hands that I had grown up looking at in a photograph, and he looked at it the way you look at something that changes the shape of what you thought you knew. We will convene a full session, he said. Of course, I said. I sat back in my chair. Above me the light still flickered. I will wait. The full session lasted 3 days. I was in and out of it for all 3 days, presenting data, answering questions, responding to requests for clarification from delegates who had spent decades in this building watching humans sit quietly along the left wall and were now working to reconcile that image with the one in front of them. The Dravathi delegate on the second day asked me how long humanity had been developing this kind of analysis capability. How long, I repeated. How many years? I thought about a 12-year-old girl who cried once and then stopped. I thought about 14 FTL frameworks stamped, redundant and filed in a drawer. I thought about 19 confirmed target selections and the 8 months I had spent being completely certain and saying nothing. Long enough, I said. The terms were ratified on the 3rd day. It was not a gift. Sareth knew it was not a gift. I knew it was not a gift. What it was a recognition that the ledger had shifted, that the numbers no longer added up the way they had added up in 2091 in a white room that smelled like recycled air. What we got back that day was a portion of what had always been ours. I sent a short message to the human delegation on Earth, 2 sentences. The corridor restrictions are lifted. Get the fleet ready. Then I went back to my quarters and sat, with the new silence for a while. The silence of a thing that has been held a long time finally being put down. Your hands do not know what to do right. Away when the weight is gone. Mine were steady, I made sure of that. The Chirov hit their 20th target 4 days later, exactly where I said they would, exactly how I said they would. We were there waiting for them. Not with a larger force, not with heavier weapons, with better positioning, better timing, and a complete understanding of the 3 decisions their commander would make before he made them. The engagement lasted 40 minutes. The Chirov withdrew. It was the first time in the war they had withdrawn from anything. The Accord was watching all of it, every delegate, every military analyst, every monitoring station that had a feed on that sector. I was watching the feed from the command room of Accord Central when the withdrawal signal came through. Around me, VETH officers in Accord staff in every species that had filed a polite letter of concern while our colonies burned were watching a human unit do something that none of their models had predicted was possible. Someone behind me said, in the VETH harmonic, how did they know? Not to me, to no one in particular. The kind of thing you say when the question is bigger than the answer you have. I kept watching the feed. On the screen, our ships were reforming. No celebrating, no broadcasting. They reformed into a new configuration and began moving toward the next position on the list, because there was always a next position, and we had been building toward it for longer than anyone in this room understood. The Chirov's second engagement came 8 days later, their third 6 days after that. We were at both of them. Not everywhere, we could not be everywhere, but we were at the places that mattered at the times that mattered, with an understanding of how an enemy thinks that you cannot buy or borrow or receive as a gift from someone who feels sorry for you. You have to earn it the long way, by watching, by waiting, by being told 40 years in a row that your seat is along the left wall, by remembering every single word of every single report that said, pattern noted. We had noted a few patterns of our own. Sareth of the Long Reach came to my office on the 15th day of active human operations. He stood in the doorway for a moment, which was a VETH gesture I had come to understand meant he was choosing words carefully. Your forces are operating outside any doctrine we recognize, he said. Yes, I said. Our analysts cannot predict your positioning from standard tactical models. No, I said, they cannot. What doctrine are you using? I looked at him. I thought about whether there was a way to explain 40 years in a sentence. Ours, I said. We are using ours. He was quiet, then very carefully, the way a large thing moves when it is not used to moving carefully. I underestimated what you had built. It was not an apology. The VETH did not apologize as a cultural matter. What it was an acknowledgement, said by 7FT Admiral who had handed a non-voting observer a courtesy coffee for 2 years of Accord sessions. It landed with the weight of everything it was not quite saying. I let it land. The 23rd target, I said after a moment. They will move on it in 11 days. I need 2 additional fleet elements and unrestricted access to the rim corridor for the approach. He nodded. You will have them, he said. He left. I looked at my notes. I looked at the Map on the wall with 37 marked positions. And a trail of confirmations in green. Going back 8 months. The debt humanity had never asked for. The one handed to us in a white room. With cold air and warm handshakes, and 6 fingers closing over 5 was not gone. But the shape of it had changed. It had stopped being a weight we carried, and started being a foundation we stood on. There is a difference. It matters. We went back to work. 11 days later, we hit the 23rd target. Before the Chirath could. Not with firepower, with presence, we were already there, deployed in a configuration that their forward scouts reported back to command, and the Chirath command made the decision we had modeled for them. They diverted, chose a different approach, burned 3 weeks of operational momentum, redirecting toward an alternate objective that we had already flagged as their fallback choice. Every time they moved where we expected. Not because we were lucky. Because Commander Owen Riel, who ran the Behavioral Analysis Division out of Callisto Station and had been doing this work for 6 years before I put his team's data on that chip, had spent those 6 years building a picture of how the Chirath think. Owen did not look like someone who changes the shape of a war. He was slight, wore the same gray jacket every day, and had the specific kind of quiet that comes from spending most of your time inside information and not much time talking about it. When I first read his work, I called him directly. How accurate is the target sequencing? I asked. 91% confident on the order, he said. Lower on specific timing, plus or minus 72 hours on most engagements. How did you build this? A pause. The kind of pause that means someone is deciding how much of the real answer to give. They fight the way scared things fight, he said, systematic, controlled, never a move they have not already decided is safe. Another pause. We recognize it because we used to fight that way too before we stopped being scared. I thought about that for a long time. After the call, we used to fight that way too. The question underneath that sentence, when did we stop being scared, is one I have turned over many times and always arrive at the same answer. We did not stop being scared, we just stopped letting the fear make our decisions. There is a gap between those two things, wide enough to fit a war in. The Chirath were afraid of losing. Every move they made was designed to eliminate risk before engaging. That is why the dissolution strategy worked on the species it had worked on before. Species North. That fight to win are defeated by strategies that make winning irrelevant. You do not have to beat them. And GT snorts. And GT, you have to make the cost of continuing rise past what they are willing to pay. Humanity understood that instinctively, because we had done it to ourselves more times than anyone had ever done it to us. From outside, we had starved ourselves, we had poisoned our own atmosphere. We had spent 2 centuries in conflicts that no one won and everyone paid for. We were, as Owen once put it in a briefing that made 3 Accord observers visibly uncomfortable, extraordinary, experienced at the specific kind of suffering that teaches you how systems fail from the inside. And that was exactly the curriculum the Chirath had never completed. The Accord fleet combined operations numbered around 400 active vessels at the start of human engagement. Human Forces numbered 83 ships, a fraction of the whole, operating under independent command authority for the first time in 40 years. The Vireth Admiralty watched our deployment patterns with an attention that was somewhere between respect and the specific frustration of a chess player watching someone solve the board with a game piece they did not realize could move that way. Our ships did not hold formation. That was the first thing every Accord analyst noted. They moved in what looked like loose clusters, independent with no visible command and control structure, linking their decisions in real time to Accord tactical observers. It looked like disorder. It was not disorder. Commander Prianair, who ran our logistics network from a converted supply vessel called the Caldwell, had designed the operational structure over 4 years of theoretical work and 6 months of live simulation. What it looked like was decentralized. What it was distributed. Every unit knew the doctrine. Every unit knew every other unit's role and fallback position. Every unit could make independent decisions within a framework so thoroughly internalized that coordination happened without instruction, the way 30 musicians who have played together for years can hear one note change and all shift together. Without a conductor, Priya had a phrase for it. She called it thinking with your neighbors. The Chareth had never fought anything that thought with its neighbors. They escalated in response to the early losses, not dramatically. The Chareth did not do dramatic, but the forward on the eastern frontier increased. New units previously held in reserve moved into operational positions. Their command structure pushed harder on approaches that had worked before, doubling down on dissolution tactics against 2 Accord installations that they had correctly identified as logistically critical. What they did not know was that we had already rebuilt the supply webs for both installations through routes the Accord logistics models did not even have recorded. When the dissolution hit, there was nothing to dissolve. The second time an installation held against a Chareth dissolution attempt, Owen called me. They are going to change tactics, he said. I know. They are going to push for a direct engagement, one major confrontation. They think it will break the Accord coalition. It might, I said. The Accord does not hold well under direct pressure. Are you going to tell Sareth? I was quiet for a moment. Yes, I said, and then I am going to ask for something he is not going to want to give me. The request was for independent authorization to pursue the Chareth command ship once the direct engagement began, not to destroy it, to board it. The room went very still when I said that. Sareth looked at me with the expression he used when he was deciding whether I was being serious. It was the same expression he had used when I put the chip on the table. He had learned since then to assume the answer was yes. You want to board a hostile command vessel, he said. I want the Chareth command hierarchy to watch as we take their bridge, I said. Not to execute anyone, not to destroy anything, just snorts to stand there in their space and let them see us. Why? It was a real question. He was not challenging me. He genuinely wanted to know. Because they have never fought a species that comes back harder when you hurt it, I said. They need to understand what we are before this war ends. The understanding is part of the ending. He thought about that. If your unit is lost in the attempt, he said. Then we are lost, I said. That is a choice we made when we put the chip on the table. He authorized it. The direct engagement came on a Tuesday, which is the kind of detail that sounds wrong for a moment that large. The Charath pushed with 40 vessels against the Accord's primary corridor junction. The Accord held with combined forces. It was the largest single engagement of the war, and it lasted 11 hours. During hour 4, while the main engagement was still fully active, Commander Riel's analysis confirmed the location of the Charath command ship. It was holding at the edge of the combat radius, directing the operation from a position of calculated safety. I took 6 ships, Priya said when I told her the number. 6. 6, I confirmed. Against a command ship. We are not fighting it, I said. We are finding it. We found it in hour 6. The Charath had not been designed to be found when it did not want to be, but humans had spent a great deal of the past 40 years finding gaps in systems that were designed to keep them out. And a command ship hiding at the edge of an engagement has a profile if you know what to look for, and Owen knew exactly what to look for. We came in through a corridor gap that did not exist on any Accord chart. The boarding was not clean. I will not pretend it was clean. We lost people. 2 of the 6 ships took damage that would take 8 months to repair. Charath crew fought with the desperation of a species that had never had their home space entered by an enemy, and discovered in real time that they did not have a protocol for it. But we reached the bridge. I stood at the entrance to the Charath command bridge with 4 people behind me and looked at a species that had been systematically dismantling the Accord's eastern frontier for 3 years, and they looked back at me. And the weight of the moment had a shape I will not try to make smaller than it was. The Charath commander was not what I expected. He was small, actually, by Charath standards, dark-eyed. He looked at me with the expression of someone doing math he had not been prepared to do. Through the translator, his words were flat. What species are you? Human, I said. A pause. The observers, he said. Yes, I said, the observers. He was quiet for a long moment. Around him, his crew was still. The engagement outside was still going on. Signals were coming in that he was not responding to, and the absence of his responses was already beginning to unravel the coordination of his forces. Why did you come here? He said. You have won without this. I thought about what Owen had told me about scared things fighting systematic, about the fear that makes all your decisions for you when you let it. Someone once lent us a hand, I said. We spent 40 years learning to carry our own weight. I needed you to see that this war ends the same way, whether you see it or not, but the next 40 years are shaped by whether you understand who you are dealing with. He looked at me. He looked at the 4 people behind me. He looked at a human standing on a Charath command bridge, and the mathematics of that image working through his calculations in real time. He reached forward and deactivated his command station. Outside, without his signal, the Charath forces began withdrawing. It took another 3 hours for the engagement to fully dissolve. It took another 9 weeks for the Charath to formally request armistice negotiations. But the war, in all the ways that actually matter, ended on that bridge. Not with destruction. With presence. With 5 humans standing in a space that had been built to be unreachable. Looking back at the people who had underestimated us and saying nothing more than what was necessary. We had been there. That was enough. The armistice negotiations lasted 4 months. I was not in most of them. That was a deliberate choice. I sent Owen to the preliminary sessions. I sent Priya to the logistics committee. I sent 12 specialists who had spent their careers inside the specific details that peace agreements need to actually hold. I stayed on the Caldwell and slept for the first time in 9 months with something resembling consistency. Not well, I want to be honest about that. The sleep was not good. There is a particular kind of tired that accumulates during sustained operational intensity, a level below the muscle and bone exhaustion somewhere in the part of you that makes decisions all day and does not stop making them when the lights go off. That tired does not go away with rest. It goes away slowly, in installments, over months or years, sometimes not completely. I got up at the same time every morning, checked the overnight dispatches, ran 4 km on the track that went around the lower cargo ring, and ate breakfast alone. The breakfast was bad. The coffee was worse. I drank it every morning because it was a thing I could control. On the 41st day of the armistice negotiations, Owen sent me a message with no subject line. Inside, a single data attachment and 2 words. Read this. The attachment was a Churath internal communication intercepted and translated by our intelligence analysts. It was a report filed by the commander I had stood across from on that bridge. I had learned his name by then, vetting compatible sounds that our translators rendered as something like Heron for working purposes. He had filed a behavioral assessment of humanity for his own high command. It was 14 pages long. I read the whole thing. He wrote that humans were unlike any species the Churath had engaged with in 600 years of recorded conflict. Not because of our weapons or our numbers or our fleet capability, because of the gap, as he put it, between what we appeared to be and what we actually were, because we had sat in observer chairs for 40 years and learned everything there was to know about the room, and then when the moment came, we had shown up already prepared for a war we were not officially in. He wrote, they do not fight to win, they fight because stopping is not a thing they know how to do. I sat with that for a while. It was not entirely right. We know how to stop. We had stopped for 40 years because stopping was the cost of a cure that saved our colonies. We had held the stopping place with both hands and not let it become something else, not let it become resentment that exploded in the wrong direction, not let it become despair. The stopping was the hardest part, harder than any engagement in any corridor, harder than any session in any observer chair, holding a thing in place for 4 decades while you do the slow work of becoming ready. But I understood what he meant, and I understood that he had meant it as a kind of respect shaped by a very different culture into a shape that looked like a threat assessment but was actually something closer to admission. They had miscalculated us. The Accord restructuring session convened on a bright morning in the Accord Central Assembly Chamber, which had been built to hold 200 delegations and was, for the first time in 40 years, arranging seating that did not put humans along the left wall. I wore the same jacket I had worn the day I put the chip on the table. Priya had told me it was bad symbolism. I told her it was perfect symbolism. She looked at me the way she always looked at me when she thought I was being deliberately difficult, which was to say, with affection that was mostly hidden under exasperation. Owen stood next to me as the chamber filled. He was wearing the gray jacket. As always, he had worn a tie for the occasion. It was the most formal I had ever seen him, and it made him look like a university lecturer who had wandered into the wrong building. "Are you ready?" he said. "I have been ready for 11 years, I said. He nodded. "Right. Are you ready?" "Right. Now for the next 2 hours specifically." I looked at him. Yes. The chamber was full, every species, every delegation, the full weight of the Galactic Accord seated in a room where, for 4 decades, humanity had held the chairs with the slightly worse lighting. Sarath of the Long Reach opened the session. He was formal as always, measured and precise, and operating from a position of acknowledged authority that had not diminished with the wars. And he ran through the formal proceedings with efficiency. The Churath Armistice terms, the Eastern Frontier Settlement, the operational debriefs, then the restructuring of human status within the Accord. He described the new terms carefully: full membership, permanent voting seat, independent fleet authority, complete removal of corridor supervision. He read each item the way you read a verdict, clearly, without emphasis, giving each word its exact due and no more. When he finished, there was a moment of silence in the chamber. I stood up. I had not been scheduled to speak. There was a formal response from the human delegation prepared, 3 paragraphs written by our diplomatic staff, appropriate and measured and grateful in the careful way that diplomatic language is grateful without actually committing to what it is grateful for. I was not going to read it. "Thank you," I said to the chamber and to Sarath specifically, and I said it in a way that was real because I meant it genuinely, without reservation. He had authorized the boarding. He had changed his own models when the evidence required it. He had in the end done what good leadership does when it encounters information it did not expect. "But these terms are right," I said. "They are. Also 40 years late." The chamber was quiet. I want to be clear about that, not as criticism, as record. I looked around the room at every delegation, at every species that had filed a letter of concern while our colonies burned, at every observer session I had sat through, in the chair with the flickering light. We did not earn our seat at this table. In the past 3 years, we earned it 40 years ago and held it in escrow while we waited for the accounting to catch up. Sarath was watching me. His face was unreadable in the way that things are unreadable when there is too much happening behind them for anyone expression to be accurate. "We are grateful for the membership," I said. "We would prefer the word restored to the word granted." I sat down. The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which in a room that size feels much longer. Then the Loran representative shifted to the color that meant considered agreement, then the Dravathi delegate, who had not said anything unpredictable in 30 years, raised his hand in the formal gesture that means noted and recorded. Then Sarath of the Long Reach said, in his 4-part harmonic, with the care of Someone choosing the exact right word. Restored. One word, but the right one. The ceremony concluded with the formal handshake. Sarath crossed the chamber. Floor toward me, the same composition as the old photograph, the same too. Species, the same reaching of hands. Across a formal distance. He extended his arm first. 6 fingers open, waiting. I reached back 5 fingers. The photograph that came out of that handshake ran across every communication channel in the accord within the hour. Same composition as the one from 2091. Same hands, different generation, but if you look at the 2 images side by side, and many people did, what you saw was the direction of the reach reversed. In the first one, the hand came down to us. In the second one, the hand came toward us, level, equal. That difference was the whole story in a single image. Priya found me afterward in the corridor, outside the chamber where I had gone to breathe air that was not full of 200 delegations and 40 years of compressed history. How do you feel? She said. I thought about it honestly. The numbers lived in my chest somewhere. 214,000. The final count of human casualties in a war we were not officially in, filed in a report that most of the Accord member species had not yet read, and several would never fully reckon with the half of Callisto Station that was gone, the ships that did not come back from the Kyrath engagement, the 2 vessels from the boarding party that were still being repaired 8 months later, the people who had been in those ships, the specific weight of sending people into danger that you yourself designed, the math of that, the way it does not get lighter when the outcome is good. I feel the numbers, I said. Priya was quiet for a moment. She was not someone who filled silences with things to make them easier to stand in. It was one of the things I valued most about her. Owen wants to know if you're coming to the debrief dinner tonight, she said. Yes, I said. He says there will be good coffee. Owen has never correctly identified good coffee in his life, I said. She almost smiled. I know he is very confident about it, though. I looked down the corridor. It was Accord Central Corridor, the same corridors I had walked for 2 years. While sitting in the observer chair, the same architecture, the same recycled light, but the chair was gone now, and the light no longer flickered, and when I walked these halls tomorrow, I would walk them as a full member of the institution that had once handed my grandfather a cure and a leash tied together in the same package. I did not know yet what to do with that fully, how to carry both things at once, the gratitude for the cure, the cost of the leash, the long years between, the weight of the people we had lost getting free. But I had learned from a long time of practice that you do not have to resolve everything to stand up straight. You carry what you carry, you do the work in front of you. You do not let the unresolved parts make your decisions for you. I went back to my quarters that evening and looked at the photograph, not the old one face down on a shelf somewhere in a box of my grandfather's things. The new one printed out and sitting on my desk, 2 hands meeting in the middle of a formal chamber that now had a seat at the front with our name on it. I thought about him, about the room in Geneva that smelled like recycled air, about the look on his face that I had spent 20 years learning to read and then spent another 12 years looking at. In the mirror, he had signed the treaty because there was no other choice, and because he Understood that sometimes you accept the only available option and then spend the rest of your life making sure that option was never the only one available. Again, he was right. He was completely right. I want that on the record clearly, because it is easy to look back on a good outcome and reframe the choices that led there as obviously correct. The choice in 2091 was not obviously correct. It was a desperate man accepting a humiliating deal to save the people he was responsible for. Everything we built afterward was built on the foundation of that choice, on the breathing room it bought us, on the 40 years of corridors and observer chairs and cold coffee and incident reports that said, pattern noted. We noted our own patterns, that was all. I put the photograph on the wall, face forward. Then I picked up my jacket, went to find Owen and his optimistically described coffee, and got back to work. The Accord had 40 years of restoration ahead of it. The eastern frontier needed rebuilding. The Karath Armistice had 17 specific provisions that required ongoing monitoring. 3 species that had gone dark during the dissolution campaign needed support frameworks. The Accord's internal structural assumptions about smaller species needed to be examined by someone who had spent a career sitting in the back of the room watching those assumptions operate in practice. There was no shortage of work. There never had been. Thunder does not ask permission before it arrives. It does not explain itself. Afterward, it simply comes and passes, and leaves the air charged with something that was not there before, and everyone in the space where it happened carries the memory of the sound in their chest for a very long time. We had been building toward that sound for 40 years. It had crossed the galaxy, and now in the quiet that follows, thunder with a seat at the front of the room and 214,000 names to carry and a whole future to build. We got back to the work that quiet always brings, the work of what comes next. We were ready for that too.